Now available in paperback and Kindle, All About Marilyn. Learn all about the struggles of a faded former teen sitcom star in this absolutely fabulous 5-star screenplay. Get All About Marilyn in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com today.
Hollywood Historical Men in Crisis.
One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Hollywood Historical Men in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Hollywood Historical Men in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about John Barrymore and his son, John Drew Barrymore. All images used in this video are under fair use of United States copyright law of 1976 and are used in conjunction with my commentary. Now, the first Hollywood historical man in crisis I'm going to be talking about is the legendary John Barrymore. Now, your John Barrymore is a legend in acting because he is a member of both the Drew and Barrymore theatrical families, and he went on to have a long career in theater and also was a part of film from the silent era, where he played roles like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in silent films and Sherlock Holmes, and then went on to be playing roles in classic films that are a part of the National Film Registry, such as Grand Hotel, 20th Century, and Midnight, which are some of the first talking films. And your John Barrymore, as he was having this great success as an actor, sadly wound up on the road to becoming a man in crisis since the day he was born. Now, your John Barrymore wound up on the road to becoming a man in crisis early in his life due to the way he and his two siblings, Lionel and Ethel Barrymore, were raised by their parents in Philadelphia. Now, as they were raised in Philadelphia, the parents really were not actively involved in their lives, and they really did not bond with their children. And as a result of them not really bonding with their children because they were constantly on the road doing theater or doing performances, the kids never really got a chance to go out here and connect and bond with their parents. So on the year that he was born, 1882, his family was touring in the U.S. with a Polish actress, Helena Modjeska, and they toured again but left the children behind. And again, this had an impact on the children's development because while your Helena Modjeska insisted the children be baptized in the Catholic Church, sadly they did not get the family structure that they needed, and they didn't get the nurturing that they needed. And as a result, your John Barrymore was a what they called sometimes badly behaved child, and that was due to the fact that he did not get any nurturing from his mother or any structure from his father because they were mostly focused on entertaining crowds as they were performing theater. And in order to try to instill discipline in your John Barrymore, what the parents did was send him away to schools. Unfortunately, this was an ineffective strategy because the only way you can teach a child discipline is by, one, the mother going out here and teaching it through modeling this exotic behavior through example, and two, the father establishing structure for a child. And sadly, your John Barrymore wasn't able to get that discipline, and this strategy just failed miserably because he attended elementary schools in 4 states, which basically destroyed his ability to have stability, which is another thing that instills discipline in children, is having stability and a routine, because when children have stability and a routine, this allows a child to have the foundation that allows them to be emotionally secure. And your John Barrymore didn't get this, even though he was sent to multiple schools. And this basically was the start of the road to your John Barrymore, winding up on the road to becoming a boy who was going to grow up to become a man in crisis. Now, as he was sent from school to school, he eventually was sent eventually to the Mount Pleasant Military Academy. And again, none of these schools really could work overall. And over time, what happened with your John Barrymore was, as his grandmother's business began to suffer and she lost control of her theater, this caused a disruption in the family. And then your John Barrymore's mother wound up passing away at 11 years old, further destabilizing his life. And this led to your John Barrymore not only having to deal with the trauma from the already unstable part of his childhood, he now had to, at 11 years old, had to deal with the passing of his mother from tuberculosis, and he had to deal with the fact that he never really knew his mother, and now he was forced to go out here and become a professional actor, something he really didn't want to do because he really wanted to go out here and be an illustrator. And this further led to your John Barrymore further going down the road to becoming a man in crisis. Now, what I found interesting here about your John Barrymore was that we saw that his grandmother had a business as related to theater. And again, this basically refutes what many feminists said, that women were being oppressed. Here we had a woman running a business, but the feminists will say that people were being oppressed in the late 19th century, but we have a woman running a business. But that's just a tangent that I wanted to talk about. But I'm going to get back to John Barrymore, who was a man in crisis. As he entered the Georgetown Preparatory School, he was it was on Georgetown University campus, but he was expelled in 1897 after he was allegedly caught in a brothel, or in some stories say that he was just drunk, but he was kicked out of this school. And again, this was what happened to him that further showed that he was going on a bad road, and that bad road got worse because his grandmother, the only female role model in his life, died, and he was basically on his own at that point. So then he traveled with his father to England, and where he joined the King's College School in Wimbledon, and then went to the Slade School of Fine Art, and devoted his time to becoming a bohemian. So this is what happened to your John Barrymore. He was on the road to becoming a man in crisis, because at this point he was also drinking at the time and headed down the road to alcoholism. And basically why he became a bohemian, because he was trying to escape from all of his troubles and all of his problems of his life. And that led to him winding up on a road that was really bad, because as he went from his mother to his father, he then got into a very disturbing relationship where he allegedly lost his virginity to his stepmother. Again, all of his life situations were very dysfunctional, and your John Barrymore, in his early years, went on the road to becoming more and more a man in crisis, and he was not able to have any sort of peace or satisfaction, because he was on the road to becoming a man in crisis due to much of the traumas he had encountered, not really being nurtured by his parents, not even knowing his own mother, losing his mother at an early age, losing his grandmother at an early age, and then winding up starting to drink to escape from his problems. And as he was trying to drink, he was trying to function. And then what happened was his father wound up dying in 1901 of syphilis. And this further wound up leading to him further becoming more and more haunted by what he called the dark spell of his father. So your John Barrymore was going through a lot of hard times as a young man, and he was trying to do things in his life, but things weren't really working out. I mean, he tried to get involved with an artist model, or actress Evelyn Nesbit, who wound up having some abortions later on, and what they called appendectomies, but it was just he wasn't able to have a relationship with this woman that he wanted, and that further led to him going down the road to becoming a man in crisis. And as he was on this road to becoming a man in crisis, again, your John Barrymore became very much looking to escape in a bottle. And it was that effort to go out here and escape in a bottle that led to your John Barrymore winding up not able to function later on as related to his career, because while your John Barrymore starred in many legendary theatrical performances and starred in many legendary films in the silent era and starred in many films in the talkie era, he just was not able to find any peace because he had suffered so much in his later life, in his early life, I meant to say, and because he was suffering in his later life through all the trauma, he wanted to drink to escape that trauma. But the whole thing was things just kept getting worse for your John Barrymore. And even though he was a great performer, he wasn't able to have the great life that he wanted to have. And eventually he wound up marrying Dolores Costello and wound up having two children with her. But those children sadly wound up on the road to becoming men and women in crisis, just like their father. And sadly, that's due to the dysfunctional model that they learned from their father, who, even though he had great success as an actor, he was not really able to maintain that success due to the fact that he just kept drinking and was extremely disruptive on the set of many projects, including Romeo and Juliet. And because he was having so many problems, he was not able to really start getting work later on in his life. And eventually, the studios wound up not wanting to work with him much longer. And sadly, during this time that he was dealing with his alcoholism, he wound up being put in a rest home, which cost $800 a day, which drained his finances. And then eventually his wife served him with divorce papers, and he had to wind up filing for bankruptcy. And again, sadly, all happened because of all of the trauma and the lack of care that he got in his early age. And your John Barrymore, again, a man who had great talent and great potential, but sadly he wound up not being able to go to maintain that success because he had a whole lot of issues from his past, and it was those issues from his past as a child that led to him sadly becoming a man in crisis, who led to the model of dysfunction that his two children followed, which led to them sadly becoming men and women in crisis, just like their dad. Now, the second Hollywood historical man in crisis I'm going to be talking about is the son of actor John Barrymore, John Drew Barrymore. Now, your John Drew Barrymore sadly wound up becoming a man in crisis like his father because he was following the same dysfunctional life paradigm that his father had established when he was younger. Now, your John Drew Barrymore was raised in the same type of dysfunctional environment that he wound up growing up in, and this is how your John Drew Barrymore wound up on the road to becoming a man in crisis. Because a lot of beta males, what happens is because their fathers were beta males, they wind up on the same life paradigm because there's nobody there to teach them the proper male life skills and male survival skills. And your John Barrymore didn't learn that because his parents were not actively in his life, and as a result, he learned dysfunction from birth, and that was what he took and taught his own son, John Drew Barrymore, and also taught his half sister, Diana Barrymore, who also was a woman in crisis, who sadly wound up passing away in 1960 due to a drug overdose. But as your John Barrymore was being raised in this dysfunctional environment, eventually his beta male father wound up separating from his mother, and as a result, he never saw his father. And since he did not see his father, he did not have a good model for manhood. And because he didn't have that model for manhood, he further went down the road to becoming a man in crisis as he was raised by his single mother. Now, his single mother was sending him to a lot of private schools, And that really further exacerbated his situation because while he was getting an education in these private schools, he was not getting his emotional needs met. Because when a child does not get their emotional needs met and they can't bond with their mothers, what happens to these men is they wind up looking for their emotional needs to be met by other things because they're not nurtured and given love. They become extremely detached and disconnected. And that possibly was one of the issues that your Drew Barrymore had in his life because his mother saw that he was just on a bad road, and he was talking about going into acting like his father. And what she did was send him to the St. John's Military Academy. And what happened was your John Drew Barrymore then enlisted in the Navy to fight in World War II, pretending to be 17 years old because they were tall for their age. But the military soon found that the boys were underage and sent them home. But your John Drew Barrymore really didn't have much direction in his life due to the fact that he did not have a father to model manhood for him and a man to go out here and show him leadership. So sadly, he wound up following in the footsteps of his father, hoping to go out here and have a career in Hollywood. But sadly, his career in Hollywood wasn't very successful. He wound up struggling as related to Hollywood. He really didn't star in many films, and sadly wound up was briefly jailed for some old traffic tickets in 1953, and then went on to television where he wound up struggling again, and he really wasn't able to build the momentum that his father had. And I guess there was a lot of the pressure as related to being an actor like his father that led to him further going down the road to becoming a man in crisis, because as he went out here and was looking to star in TV shows and trying to move his career forward, he wound up getting further involved with drugs and alcohol. And as he wound up getting further involved in drugs and alcohol, looking to escape all of the stress he was having, he wound up struggling and having more problems, and again eventually winding up to the point where he wasn't able to go out here and do things like being able to pay his alimony, which his ex-wife sued him for. And then he was arrested and suspected of hitting somebody in 1959 in drunk driving, and he also wound up quitting a touring company of Look Homeward Angel after a week and a half of rehearsals. And he was struggling with trying to make a career in Hollywood. He didn't have the success of his father, and I guess that had him having some serious issues, and that's what led him going further into the bottle. And in an effort to escape the failures he was having in America, he then traveled to Europe to restart his film career, and he did a few films here and there, but never really got any major success. And even though he made 16 films in Europe, he was still struggling to have that career. And while he did guest spots on legendary shows like Gunsmoke, Rawhide, Run for Your Life, and Dundee and the Colhane, and the 1967 TV film Winchester 73, he never really was able to get his career to be the success that his father had, and his behavior became more antisocial and more erratic, and he was again incarcerated for drug use and domestic violence, and wound up still struggling. I mean, he was not able to really get his career going, and I believe that really frustrated your John Drew Barrymore, who saw his father being this major success, and he wanted to be able to build on that name, and it was a lot of pressure to build on that name, but he wasn't able to go out here and build on that name. No, all he could do was get little roles here and there, and he was set to star in a guest role in a Star Trek episode called The Alternative Factor, but he didn't show up, and that's what led to him getting a suspension of 6 months from the SAG union. And after that suspension, he worked here and there, but then was again arrested and imprisoned for possession of drugs following a car crash, and then in 1969 was arrested again for possession of drugs, in another car accident. and then eventually wound up withdrawing from acting after a 1974 episode of Kung Fu and a 1976 TV film, Baby Blue Marine. And these addictions that he had to drugs and alcohol just basically tore his life apart because I believe he was looking to escape all of the pressure he was having to go out here and be an actor on the level of his father. And this is why his mother wound up trying to persuade him to avoid being an actor. But he went into Hollywood possibly hoping to be successful like his father. But the whole thing is he wound up becoming just as dysfunctional as his father, being alienated from his ex-wives and his children, including Drew Barrymore, who is his daughter, and he had one of and his other three children. And sadly, your John Drew Barrymore wound up eventually just becoming reclusive and then disappearing into the wilderness to live a mystical existence. But basically, he was a homeless guy, estranged from his children, and his lifestyle continued to worsen as his mental health deteriorated. And eventually, in 2003, his daughter Drew moved him near her home, even though she was estranged from her father, paid his medical bills until his death from cancer at the age of 72. And this man in crisis sadly just followed in the footsteps of his father. And those footsteps of dysfunction were the same footsteps that led to his own children following in those footsteps. And one of the Barrymore children sadly wound up dying as late in about 2014. I believe her name was Jessica Barrymore. And again, showing me how when you have one beta male, it creates 2 to 3 generations of beta males, and those beta males breed generation after generation of dysfunction. And when I look at your John Drew Barrymore, again, it proves everything that I see in the black community about the family. When the father is dysfunctional, it leads to the boys becoming men in crisis, and those men in crisis pass on their dysfunction from generation to generation as culture and values. And that's basically what happened here with your John Drew Barrymore. He wound up following in the footsteps of his dysfunctional father and wound up becoming a man in crisis like his dad, and his children wound up becoming men and women in crisis who were trying to deal with addiction because they learned not to solve their problems or work on their problems with mental health counselors and specialists. No, they learned to work on their problems by escaping through a bottle. And that's what happens with your beta male. Whenever things get too big or overwhelming for them, they look to escape in a bottle, and that escaping in a bottle leads to their entire life deteriorating, and then they wind up with their life falling apart. And even though your John Drew Barrymore had a somewhat a struggling career, again, he wasn't as great as his father because he learned how to be a man in crisis because his father just wasn't in his life. Now, if you want to learn more about what leads to men becoming dysfunctional, like your John Barrymore and John Drew Barrymore, you can pick up my book, The Man Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Man Crisis at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you want to see me make more videos in the Hollywood Historical Men in Crisis series, you can send a donation to the Cash App or PayPal. And if I know something about that Hollywood historical celebrity in crisis, I will make that video for you. That's all I have to say for this installment in the Hollywood Historical Men in Crisis series. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and e-readers, all about Nikki, a fabulous first season. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air meets Clueless in this absolutely fabulous African-American 1990s teen sitcom. Get all 13 episodes of All About Nikki, the fabulous first season, in paperback and e-readers today.